So the I-STARR project is supported by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of the larger NIH Helping to End Addiction Long-Term, or the HEAL initiative. And it's one of several projects that comprise the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science, or the COARS network. Now, this training is the second webinar in the I-STARR Researcher Training Series, but the first training that's geared specifically towards folks who are interested in studying recovery housing. So what does that mean? So it means that we've developed webinars on topics that are particularly relevant to conducting research on recovery housing. So each webinar in this series will focus on a specific methodological aspect of research. In addition to providing a primer of sorts on the topic, the webinars will also highlight how recovery housing researchers have addressed these topics in their own research. Next slide, please. So I am Amy Miracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who is a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, or UCSF. The team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Mina Subramanian and Liba Lee, and communications specialists Diane Schmidt and Dustin Kebsu. Next slide, please. So the I-STARR project activities are guided by a 17-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. Now, while most advisory board members wear several different hats, as a whole, they represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. We may have some of our advisory board members in our audience, and I'm excited to share that some of our board members will also serve as presenters in this webinar series. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit of background on the I-STARR project, but before I introduce today's webinar and webinar presenters, we'd like to do some quick polling to get a pulse on the virtual audience members here. Just 4 questions in this poll, and that's what best describes your field of study, at what stage in your studies are you in this field, how familiar are you with different types of research study designs, and what you're most interested in learning about. So let's launch the poll now and go to the next slide. And folks who are familiar with Zoom polling, you might have to scroll to see all of the questions, and it won't let you submit your answers until you've answered all of them. But once you do, the poll should disappear. And we'll look at the results once we have a critical mass of about 70 or 80% of participants responding. And here we are. So interesting. It looks like we have 20%, around 20% of folks who are identifying their field of study as psychology. We have social work represented, health sciences, and something else. So whenever I see something else, I love to see folks drop in the chat what that other field would be, so we can better capture things in future polls. At what stage are folks at in their studies? So it looks like most people have completed their terminal degree in the past 10 years. So still a bunch of early stage folks we have represented, and familiarity with research designs. Actually, the most popular rating was a 4. So this will be good. So given these responses, I think there will be something here for everyone. If you're looking to learn about different types of research designs, you're definitely in the right place. And if you have particular expertise in a type of study design, but have yet to apply it to recovery housing research, you'll be able to hear from folks who have done this work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm very pleased to say that we have 3 different presenters for this webinar, Doctors Michael Shropshire, Leonard Jason, and Doug Polson. And we're definitely leading off this series with some true superstars in the field. So Dr. Michael Shropshire has worked in a variety of roles in his decades-long career as a researcher. He currently serves as the program coordinator for UCSF's Learning for Early Careers in Addiction and Diversity, or the LEAD program. He has over 25 years of experience as a drug use researcher at UCSF, working on studies funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. He also has over 20 years of experience teaching university undergraduate and graduate level research methods, statistics, and psychology courses. He spent a decade as a regulatory affairs coordinator at UCSF, ensuring that research studies were in compliance with federal guidance regarding the protection of human subjects. He studied advanced statistics for over 35 years and has extensive experience as a data analyst and statistician. He's also co-author of the SAMHSA treatment manual and workbook called Anger Management for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Clients, which is one of the most widely disseminated substance use disorder treatment manuals by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now, we'll also be hearing from Dr. Leonard Jason. Dr. Jason is a professor of psychology at DePaul University and the director for DePaul's Center for Community Research. He's also a former president of the Division of Community Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Jason has edited or written 30 books and has published over 900 articles and 100 book chapters. He's also served on the editorial boards of over 10 psychological journals and on review committees of the National Institutes of Health. He's received over $47 million in federal research grants. And since the early 1990s, his group has been studying the effectiveness of Oxford houses using multiple methods and trying to understand the dynamic processes accounting for change among residents. And finally, we'll be hearing from Dr. Doug Polson. So Dr. Polson is a program director at the Public Health Institute and has been an adjunct faculty member for the John F. Kennedy University and UC Berkeley extension programs and has taught a variety of courses on alcohol and drug use. He's also been principal investigator on multiple NIH-funded studies, including 7 grants studying sober living houses and 3 studying motivational interviewing interventions. Dr. Polson is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and since 1979, he's worked as a clinician, supervisor, or an administrator in a variety of substance use and mental health treatment programs. Dr. Polson completed a doctorate in counseling psychology at Northeastern University and a master's in clinical psychology at San Francisco State University. His clinical training and professional work has included positions in the Cambridge Hospital Department of Psychiatry in Massachusetts and at San Francisco General Hospital. And with those introductions, I am pleased to hand things off to our presenters, starting with Dr. Shropshire to talk about the topic of experimental and quasi-experimental study designs, and then to Drs. Jason and Polson, who present examples of these types of study designs from their own recovery housing research. Take it away, Michael.
Okay, good morning. Let's see the first slide, please. Next slide. In my talk today, I'm going to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of experimental and quasi-experimental designs. Next slide. Here's the basic elements of a two-group experimental design. The investigator manipulates an independent variable. The independent variable is the cause in a cause-effect claim. Participants are assigned to conditions by random assignment. Ideally, random assignment is thought to equate the two groups. A researcher measures the dependent variable that's expected to vary with conditions of the independent variable. The experimental effect is the difference between conditions on the dependent variable. If there's a difference between groups, a strong causal statement can be made. Next slide. Here's a figure from my textbook, from the textbook I used for my introductory psychopathology course to show the difference between a correlational design and an experimental design. Participants in the correlational design complete a measure of stressful events. In this idealized example, stress is operationally defined as the scores on the Holmes-Rahe life event survey, such as getting a new job, moving, divorce, death of a loved one. The study question is, does stress cause an increase in blood pressure? You can calculate a correlation coefficient between those two measures to see if the relationship is there. So how do you create an experimental analog of the correlational study? I picked this figure not only to contrast the difference between the two designs, but to show an extreme example of a laboratory experiment from experimental psychopathology. In a laboratory setting, we can define a stressful event as giving a speech in front of an audience. However, giving a speech may not be very stressful compared to ongoing life stressors. But the main point is random assignment. Participants are randomly assigned to conditions to equate the two groups. The independent variable is giving a speech in front of an audience, and the dependent variable is the blood pressure. If blood pressure is higher in the speech condition than the control condition of sitting quietly, then a strong causal statement can be made. Stress causes higher blood pressure. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to discuss how a person can play a counterfactual parlor game with a correlational study, which also applies to quasi-experimental designs because they have no random assignment. You can think of various what-if scenarios to explain away the purported cause-effect claim. Next slide. This slide reviews some key concepts. Internal validity is the extent to which the experimental effect is due to the manipulated independent variable. It's usually a contrast between an active intervention and a control condition. A control condition is the standard upon which treatment effectiveness is judged. External validity, or ecological validity, is the extent to which results generalize beyond the study. Some basic questions are, will the results apply to others besides the participants in the study? Study participants in our field are often convenience samples from one program in one specific city and at a specific time in history. These limits to external validity should be considered when reading about study findings, and which leads to the next topic I have on the slide, disadvantages of experiments. Experiments may be artificial. In many classic studies of psychological interventions, a randomized controlled clinical trial often requires study procedures that increase internal validity at the expense of external validity. Special clinics are set up. Study therapists that are hired for the study have light caseloads. They are trained extensively to follow a treatment manual, and therapist adherence and competence is monitored. That's not what usually happens in the real world. The next point is that some studies may be impossible to do as experiments. A community may not like the idea of participants in a control condition not receiving treatment. And some communities don't like researchers. They think researchers just helicopter in, do a study, exploit the subjects, and then they leave. The next point is that it's expensive to conduct a larger randomized trial. It may be too premature to spend more money on a randomized study because there's no pilot data to justify the expense. It's necessary to gather pilot data and break down an observed gross effect into a net effect that's due to the treatment alone before going further. Next. Oh, next slide, yes. In this slide, I've listed quotations from a classic book by Cook and Campbell, which has been cited in many subsequent research methods textbooks. Did Cook and Campbell think that there are any merits to quasi-experimental designs? First, again, there's no random assignment. They admit that they are useful in suggesting new ideas, but normally not sufficient for permitting strong tests of causal hypotheses. They fail to rule out a number of plausible alternative explanations, but they admit experimental design is only one way to rule out alternative interpretations. Sometimes threats to validity can be ruled out in non-design ways. For example, these days, structural equation modeling can be used to control for confounds and make stronger causal statements. Next. This slide is a quick summary. So Cook and Campbell, seminal contribution for quasi-experimental designs is that there's discussion of internal and external validity. So again, internal validity, does the independent variable produce the independent variable? A researcher has to rule out alternative explanations of the observed cause and effect relation. So Cook and Campbell had this, you may have seen this in your classes, classic threats to internal validity, and they're on the next slide. So here's a quick review of them. You want to ask the question again, is this threat operating in my quasi-experiment? And it's up to the community of researchers and practitioners to decide. The first threat is an historical event. An event during the study is the causal agent. Here's an example. Imagine doing a study in 2001 on stress, anxiety, coping, and the events of 9/11 happened. An entire population can change as a result of such an event. That's an extreme example I chose for dramatic effect, but any event counts, such as doing a group session and a fire drill happens or a power outage. Then there's testing. A pre-test or multiple testing can create demand characteristics in that participants figure out what the study's about and complete the measures to please the experimenter. Another possibility is that just practice and familiarity with the test may increase scores on the second testing. Then there's instrumentation. Consistency and inconsistency in scoring can create error. Radar drift or calibration drift can influence the scoring of a measure. I've done a lot of addiction severity index training and administered it many times. Many ASI rules are unusual in my opinion, and I know from working in quality assurance that research assistants forget to apply the ASI rules over time. So the actual measure in a way can change over time. Next slide. The next two threats, attrition and selection bias, apply to two group quasi-experimental designs. So attrition, subjects can drop out and groups are not equivalent at the end of the treatment phase. This is a big problem when the more severe subjects drop out or the dropout is greater in one group than the other. Then there's selection bias. No random assignment may mean that the groups are not equivalent at the start of the study. Maturation usually refers to children maturing over time, but maturation refers to any processes within the participant that happens over time, such as growing older, stronger, wiser, or more tired and bored. So study participant symptom levels may have improved regardless of the intervention, which is often called spontaneous recovery. The next slide is about statistical regression. This example shown on this slide is from a book called A Primer on Regression Artifacts by Campbell and Kenny. In one chapter, they show that one type of statistical regression is merely mathematical. On the slide, in the regression equation between 2 points, I have on the slide a regression equation. If you see that at the top, it's in the z-score form. Again, the z-score has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So there is no y-intercept in that regression line. And then what I've done as an exercise is just put in some z-scores in this table. So zx multiplied by r equals the outcome zy prime. And what you see in a nutshell is there is no change just merely due to the unreliability of the test. The score goes down from 1.88 to 1.94. Now, this is just one example. This is a decrease in scores, but what happens with regression is the low scores go up and the high scores go down. It's not a real effect. A lot of people confuse that. It's just math. It's not a real process like spontaneous recovery, which I talked about earlier. That's maturation. Right, next slide. Oops, sorry. I just want to show you in these designs, 0 or O, that's measurement, observation, and X is the intervention. Let's go to the first one, next slide. So this is the one group post-test design. So you see time 1, there is no measurement. X is the intervention, and 0, O2, I mean, is the observation at the second time point. So in this first quasi-experimental design, Campbell and Stanley derogatorily called it, and you may see this in books, the one-shot case study, and cited experimental psychologist E.G. Boring as stating that the absence of a control condition makes the design of no scientific value. But this position was revived revised later by Campbell and colleagues, and they focused on ways the design could be strengthened. So here's my example. Suppose that you had a treatment of cognitive therapy and gave the Beck Depression Inventory at time 2. Now, if you make the assumption that your study had depressed people, and even though you didn't have time 1, you could say, well, they're in a depression clinic, they probably would have scored high. And if at time 2, they scored low, you could say, well, I think that there's something to explore there. And similarly, in our substance abuse field, I tend to have the opinion or perception that it's very hard to get clean urine screens. If I only tested at time 2 and I saw a lot of clean urines, I might say this is worth exploring this treatment. It resulted in a low amount of urine screens. There are many threats, though, to internal validity that I mentioned on the prior slide. History, maturation, selection bias, mortality. So why don't we go to the next slide now? This is the next design, the one group pre-post test design. And all of these threats to validity can happen. There's time 1, an intervention, time 2. Next slide. So I'm going to show you my own research, and I figured I should show you my own research and not seem like a bully and criticize someone else's research. If I knock my own research, that's probably all right. So this is where we gave a 12-week anger management treatment. And you can see that compared to baseline, trait anger decreases. Now, where I have the arrow is the regression effect. And so I would claim that that first drop at 4 weeks is due to regression, probably not a real effect. But I would claim anything after that is actually an effect. That's my claim. You could disagree with me, but that's my claim. So what might be the threats to this design? Well, it's probably not regression towards the mean, but it could be demand characteristics. Our subjects really liked us. Maybe they just, I know they liked us. Maybe they just said they were less angry just to please us. Also, the subjects were in the background substance abuse treatment, and they attended 12-step meetings as part of that treatment. So 12-step meetings also focus on anger. Maybe that's what caused the anger reduction, not our treatment. The background treatment makes people generally less distressed. We know that. Maybe that's what the anger measure is picking up. Or maybe people just become less angry over time, a spontaneous remission effect. Any of those threats can be used to criticize my claim. The next slide. The next design is a little bit better. It looks a little like the experimental design. You notice there's 2 groups, an active group where the X is at, and a comparison group. But again, there's no random assignment in this design. You just use possibly intact groups. So here's next slide. What we tried to do is we tried to compare our 12-week anger management treatment to a comparison condition. The comparison condition had people that couldn't show up because of a scheduling conflict. And we had hoped that they'd be equated. There is no random assignment. So you see at baseline, this didn't work. The active anger treatment had 24. The comparison group had 21. It generally stayed the same across time. But you always can ask the question about whether selection occurred. Are those 2 groups really different? And so any of the threats to validity might still be valid. But let's go to the next slide. And so the notion is the comparison group would control for history, maturation, testing, and instrumentation, because these threats would influence both the treatment and comparison groups. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to just end with the summarize the trade-offs between internal and external validity. Experiments allow for strong causal inference. If you don't have an experiment, people can always play this parlor game of saying there's threats to internal validity that you did not consider. The disadvantages is they can be artificial and they can lack ecological validity. And also the expense may not be warranted until quasi-experimental data are collected. Quasi-experiments, in contrast, may have stronger ecological validity. They kind of tend to happen in the real world, but threats to internal validity may be an issue. I think that's my last slide. Next slide, just to make sure. Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Very nice overview. And what I'm going to try to do is provide an example with the recovery home community and using an experimental design. And what I'm going to suggest is that there are some very unique challenges in doing this type work that, as Michael has said, might not always be the most appropriate one. First, let me tell you about the setting that I worked with. Oxford Houses were started in 1975 by Paul Malloy. Today, it's really a grassroots movement. It's one of the largest networks of recovery homes in the country. There's over 3,000 recovery homes called Oxford Houses. They serve over 25,000 people. It's all self-run. There's no professional staff. And they have three basic rules. You cannot use substances. You have to pay your fair share of the rent, and you have to follow the house rules. If you do those things, you can stay in the house for as long as you'd like. In the current cost-conscious environment, it does represent an inexpensive and potentially effective setting, promoting abstinence. Now, I was fortunate in the early 1990s to see Paul Malloy on TV in the 60 Minutes, and I was able to contact him and began, in a sense, working with the organization. And my research team, in a sense, really tried to get to know the Oxford House community. And we collected some pilot data, and we eventually decided to try to apply for an NIH grant. The NIH reviewers wanted us to conduct a randomized study, but our group actually felt this wasn't possible because each house votes on whether to allow new residents to live in their house. So after 7 years of working on this, I eventually mentioned to Paul Malloy, the CEO and founder, that we probably would not be able to get NIH funding. And then Paul said to me, we're going to make it happen. So we had worked 7 years to try to get this funding. And basically, we had gotten to know each other. And he began to, in a sense, trust us. So I think the key thing that I'm going to emphasize here is the importance of the relationship with the people that you're working with, particularly with community-based organizations. I might add that Paul, many years later, said to me that another group had come to him and said, I want to do a randomized controlled trial with Oxford House without having that 7 years of experience. And Paul said to them, no. So really having a relationship with the individuals who basically have that kind of gut feeling of what it's about and really have sort of developed the innovation is so critical. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. Well, eventually, we were able to make it work by having, in a sense, if a person was brought to one house and they weren't voted in, we'd bring them to a second house. And we were able to actually kind of get funding and do the study. So let me tell you a little bit about the study, and we'll go to the next slide. This is what the study was about. As Michael has suggested, randomization is critical. Some people get the treatment, some people get the control. You then follow them up over time and you compare the results. This is, again, typical classic way of doing randomized research. Next slide. Participants just completing substance abuse treatment went either into an Oxford House or usual care. We approached 154 individuals and 150 agreed to participate. And all those assigned to the Oxford House condition were accepted. And again, the reason it's important to think about this is you might approach hundreds of people and only get a very small percentage that want to participate. So you really need to say, how many did you approach to potentially be in the study? And if most of the people you approached came into the study, that's actually a good methodological sign. Next slide. We interviewed individuals every 6 months for 24 months. And across these 4 waves, we actually got 89% of the last wave of the Oxford House and 86% of the usual care. And again, as Michael had suggested, mortality is a real problem. Do you keep both groups in? And if you can get most groups in at around that 90% rate at the end of your study, you're actually doing pretty well. Next slide. Our outcomes were basically the Oxford House compared to the usual care condition had basically better abstinence rates, monthly income was better, lower incarceration rates. Next slide. So this is basically a figure you can see with abstinence rates almost twice the abstinence rates with Oxford houses. Incarceration rates were significantly lower, and monthly income. When you're gaining about $1,000 a month, you're basically, at least at that time, this was done in the early 2000s, you're really getting close to getting out of poverty. Next slide. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about is these issues of how we got this study going. First, I want to say that the results were disseminated widely. And basically, I think the outcome was that this type of lower cost, non-medical, community-based care can have important contributions to those with alcohol and other substance use problems. And the findings from the study actually helped get the federal government to list Oxford houses within the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, what SAMHSA had put out. So there's some real kind of advantages here. But let me again kind of talk about what I think needs to occur if you're going to do randomized studies with recovery homes. I think it's really critical to have a relationship with the community settings, really not a short-term one, a long-term one, to build that trust and to show over that time that mutual benefits can occur, both to the researcher as well as to the organization. Now, Kathleen Gibson has now taken over in terms of the Oxford House organization. Paul Malloy recently died. Both of them have made such important contributions, but I just want to kind of give a couple anecdotes of what does it mean to build that connection, basically trust between us and the researchers and us. For example, you need to have time. You really need to let that relationship kind of, in a sense, mature and develop so that they can basically willing to say, we'll do a randomized study, for example, as we did. What does that trust look like? When Oxford House first came to Illinois, they opened up houses and they came to our research meetings and tape recorded us to sort of find out what we were doing as we sent our researchers into their houses to find out what they were doing. For a year, we just spent time getting to know each other, that mutual process of trust. So again, I'm going to emphasize, sometimes it's really good to have that time period for a year, for several years, before doing some of these types of more kind of experimentally randomized designs if you're going to do them. I also want to emphasize, basically, we can get messages from our constituents, the people we're collaborating with. Kathleen Gibson and Paul Malloy invite me every year to present at their convention. So before this particular randomized study occurred, we actually gave a presentation about what we were going to be doing for our study. And one of the people in the audience came up to me and sort of said, that woman over there's my girlfriend. And I would have never even talked to her before because she has HIV. And I was very biased and prejudiced. So what you need to do is put in measures of tolerance, of kind of do we change as people, not just to stop taking drugs and alcohol. And that was really important information that we got. And when we went back to our group, we incorporated that into our study. And we actually found that tolerance changed significantly over time for those in the Oxford House condition versus those in the control condition. So I think what's important now is to sort of think about, why is it that everyone doesn't have a very successful outcome in these types of recovery homes like Oxford houses? A certain percentage don't make it. And that's the things we're trying to understand now. What makes for successful trajectory? Why do some people have successes, some people don't? And I've been very fortunate to work with John Light, who's a sociologist, mathematician, looking at social networks. So for example, if you have people who you seek advice from, are they higher recovery than you are? If they're lower recovery than you are, actually the results are not as positive. So that's what we're trying to do, understand those mechanisms that we've been able to say, if it works, why does it work? Thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn things over to another incredibly important investigator in the field, Doug Polston.
Thank you, Lenny. The focus of the webinar today is on research design issues. So I decided to focus mostly on the research team's process and rationale for choosing a quasi-experimental design. So in order to have time to address some of these issues, I'll only present a very brief summary of the study itself, but the results of the study did provide a foundation for additional studies, and I'll briefly identify a few of those if I have time at the end. Next slide, please. My motivation to study sober living houses was based on my clinical experience in treatment programs, where a common frustration for staff and clients was that improvements resulting from treatment were often not sustainable because clients lacked an affordable alcohol and drug-free living environment. Sober living houses addressed both of these concerns and provided peer support for recovery. Also, residents could stay as long as they wanted, provided they followed house rules. So the sober living houses addressed a lot of issues that were problematic to treatment folks. To study sober living houses, we approached Clean and Sober Transitional Living, which I'll refer to as CSTL, which is an organization in Sacramento County that had been providing recovery home services for 17 years. They operated 16 houses that were members of the California Association of Addiction Recovery Resources. So they were subject to standards and regular inspections of the houses to monitor health and safety. At the time we began the study in 2003, there were 136 beds and 90% of the residents were private pay. The house used a social model approach to recovery that emphasized abstinence from alcohol and drugs, involvement in 12-step recovery groups, peer support, and empowerment of residents in terms of having input into decisions and house operations. Next slide, please. At the time the grant was funded, there was very little research on sober living houses. And so we felt an initial study should use a repeated measures quasi-experimental design that could provide a broad look at outcomes for the entire population of persons entering the houses. So to us, it didn't make sense to examine subgroups of residents or try to develop a randomized design because we had no preliminary data to justify a focus on subgroups or inform what those studies should look like. Based on what we found in this initial study, we could then identify subgroups and issues that needed more attention. The study design that we used had the advantage of allowing us to investigate various questions and include all the residents in the program, not just selected subgroups, such as people attending outpatient treatment while they lived in the house, or people referred from residential treatment programs. So we wanted to know, do residents make improvements after they enter the houses? In what areas are improvements made? Are improvements sustained over time, or do they fall apart rapidly after they're achieved? Do the improvements continue only if residents stay in the sober living houses, or do they persist even after residents leave? Are there subgroups of residents that do better than others, and what are the predictors of outcome? CSTL used the social model approach to recovery. So we wanted to know if characteristics of social models, such as involvement in 12-step groups and peer support for recovery, predicted outcome. We wanted to form a partnership with the houses and get input about the study design. So we met with the person who owned the houses and some of the house managers. They made it clear that there was little support for a randomized design because house managers were not willing to support having acceptable applicants randomized to some type of comparison condition. There was also consensus that many incoming residents would not agree to be randomized because they were interested specifically in admission to CSLT. Some of the residents had learned about CSLT from word of mouth, mostly people who had been in one of the houses or knew someone who had. And for some incoming residents, that factored heavily in terms of seeking help. They didn't want to be referred randomly to some type of comparison group they didn't know anything about. The view of the house managers was that residents made improvements, but they felt they needed data to substantiate those improvements. So similar to the research team, the house managers were interested in getting a very broad view of outcomes for the entire population over time. In a later grant that built upon the quasi-experimental study, we sought out perceptions about sober living houses from various stakeholders, including neighbors of the houses, the county probation department, city manager's office, public health department, and housing department. And again, there was consensus that the most important thing they wanted to know was how residents were doing. So were they avoiding alcohol and drugs? Were they staying out of legal trouble? Were they good neighbors? Were they working or in school? The stakeholders were concerned about whether residents were making and maintaining improvements that had a positive impact on the community. And these were questions our research design could address. Next slide, please. So we recruited 245 residents. We interviewed them at baseline, 6, 12, and 18-month follow-up. And we interviewed them if they were in the house. We interviewed them if they had left the house. Our goal was to find everybody at every time point, regardless of where they were living. We used generalized estimating equations as the primary analytic tool. Next slide, please. Some of our measures assessed a 6-month time period, and these included abstinence, frequency of substance use, arrests, and employment. We hypothesized 6-month measures would show significant improvement between baseline 6-month follow-up, and improvements would persist at 12 and 18 months. We used the Addiction Severity Index to assess alcohol and drug severity over the last 30 days. We hypothesized entering residents would have low problem severity at baseline that would remain low at 6, 12, and 18 months. And we used the brief symptom inventory as a measure of psychiatric severity, which was a secondary outcome. Next slide, please. To assess whether social model characteristics predicted outcome, we use the Important People Instrument, which is a measure of recovery and general social support, and the Alcoholics Anonymous Affiliation Scale to assess involvement in 12-step groups. Next slide. Okay, so what you see here is the pattern for our 6-month abstinence. And you can see between baseline and 6 months, the percent abstinent goes way up, and it remains elevated at 12 and 18 months. And this was the same pattern for all of our measures assessing a 6-month time period. And so these included arrests, days employed, and frequency of substance use, as well as abstinence. And again, the pattern is people enter the houses, they make significant improvement between baseline and 6 months, and those improvements continue at 12 and 18 months. It's important to note that the improvements persisted over time, despite the fact that large numbers of residents were leaving the houses. 91% of the study participants left the house by 18 months. 82% left by 12 months. So improvements, for the most part, were continuing even after residents left the houses. Next slide, please. Okay, this was the pattern for ASI drug severity. And the bar to the left indicates a relatively low severity mean of 0.08 at baseline, The addiction severity index creates scores of 0 to 1. So score of 0.08 is relatively low. So low severity at baseline. And that's because a lot of the incoming residents had started some steps towards recovery, either going to AA or cutting down on their own, or some came from a treatment program. And so the month before they entered, they were doing a little bit better. And you can see between baseline and 6 months, there's a significant decrease in severity and only a slight increase at 12 and 18 months. And we had hypothesized that ASI scores would be low at entry and remain low. But in fact, we saw significant decreases at 6, 12, and 18 months. And that actually argues against regression toward the mean, because you would not expect low severity at intake at the time they entered the house to go down further and then stay down. It argues against regression to the mean in that way. When we looked at predictors of outcome, we did find that the important people instrument and the Alcoholics Anonymous affiliation scale predicted alcohol and drug outcomes. So that was, we felt, supportive to some degree of social model recovery. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a few limitations I wanted to mention. Causality is uncertain. There are unknown advantages and disadvantages compared to other living arrangements. So we don't know how sober living house residents would have fared in other settings. And this was a single site study, so additional studies were needed to generalize results. Next slide, please. So findings from the study identified subgroups and issues that became the focus of new studies. These included a study of criminal justice of Valve residents and a multi-level study that incorporated a new measure of social model recovery. Criminal justice involved residents in the Sacramento study had substance use outcomes that were similar to other residents, but their employment and legal outcomes were worse. This led to the development of a motivational interviewing intervention designed to help these residents. We tested the new intervention using a design where we randomized houses to study conditions rather than randomizing individuals. We found social model characteristics predicted outcome, and based on that, we developed a new measure to assess social model called the Recovery Home Environment Scale, or the RHES, R-H-E-S. And that measure is now being used as part of a larger study to assess multi-level effects on outcome that include individual house and neighborhood influences. And in fact, we're finding it to be a strong predictor of outcome at 6 months. Next slide, please. Okay, resources. And I think, Amy, you're gonna say a few words about resources.
Yes, well, I just want to say thank you to our amazing presenters. And we've tried to cover as much as we could within the context of an hour-long webinar, but there's so much that can be said on the topic of research designs, as well as about the 2 studies that we highlighted in this webinar. So to make sure that folks have access to information on the topic and these studies, we pulled together a list of resources where you can learn more. And this slide contains information on some textbooks that Michael mentioned, some journal articles, and some other resources such as the Oxford House website, as well as resources on California sober living houses. And we can drop those into the chat as well. Let's go to the next slide. So now that you've heard some about different types of research study designs and heard from researchers who've used these designs in their recovery housing research, I do want to open things up so that folks can ask questions of these researchers and about the topic of research study designs. And folks are welcome to raise their hand within Zoom or drop a question into the chat. I think that we have time for at least 2 or 3 questions. if folks have them. And feel free to also unmute yourselves if we don't see hands raised, and just jump right in. Any questions?
Amy, we have one in the chat. I have one from Laura. She says, can you recommend a recovery capital assessment tool specific for recovery housing settings?
Lenny and Doug, I definitely have my favorite. What ones would you guys recommend?
We used the one, I'm trying to remember, Amy, I think it was the one developed by Bill White and his colleagues. And I think that's the tool that we used in our paper on recovery capital.
And I would suggest Dr. Best, BEST, might be somebody that you want to look at some of his work. That's another pretty important person in the field. We have an instrument that we call Recovery Factor, which is made up of 8 domains. And we have been using that in our Oxford House recovery work. And again, if you send me an email, I'm happy to share that tool with you.
Yep, and I've used the assessment of recovery capital, the ARC, as well as the BARC, the brief assessment of recovery capital, David Best measures in my recovery housing research. Other questions? Well, if not, I do want to tell you a little bit more about what might be coming up down the road with this training series. In August, we'll have 2 webinars, again, with different tracks, one for operators, providers, as well as one for those who are wanting to conduct research on recovery housing. The recovery housing operator or provider webinar will be on the topic of recovery housing, specifically recovery housing management and operation. And this will be led by Joel Bagley and Beth Fisher-Sanders, both of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences. Our researcher webinar will be on the topic of sampling and collaborating with recovery residence providers, and will feature biostatistician Meena Subbaraman, who is in this webinar today, as well as Elizabeth Mahoney and myself providing examples of different sampling techniques in recovery housing research. So just a reminder, the I-STARR webinars are always held on Tuesdays from 11 to 12 for folks on the West Coast, which is from 2 to 3 for folks on the East Coast. The operator provider webinars, as well as the webinars that are germane to all stakeholders, what we call our all audience webinars, are held the first Tuesday of the month, and the researcher webinars are the third Tuesday of the month. And you can learn more about these webinars, the I-STARR project, on our website. There's a picture of it here on this slide. And on the website, you can sign up for our newsletter, and you can also stay in touch with us by connecting with us on our social media sites, which are also listed on this slide. Next slide, please. Finally, before folks sign off, I just want to talk directly to folks who are registered for the entire 12 webinar researcher training series, or those who are considering registering for it. So this webinar counts towards the 12 trainings for the researcher training series. And those who attend all 12 webinars in this series will receive certification of completion and will be provided the opportunity of being identified on the I-STARR website as someone who's completed this training. We can track attendance for all folks who attend the webinars live, but if you have to miss a live webinar, we'll be building a platform onto our webpage for folks to view webinars there. Although all the webinars will be on the website, folks who are registered and view the webinars on the platform not only can have their viewing count towards the completion of the series, but can also ask questions about the content to the I-STARR team members and provide feedback on the webinars. So that's a little bit about the researcher training series. If you're registered, fantastic. If you're considering it, check it out on the website. For all folks, it's been an absolute delight and pleasure to share this information with you. And we hope to see you at another webinar down the road. Again, the next researcher webinar is Tuesday, August 15th on the topic of sampling and collaborating with recovery research residents, operators, and providers. The next all audience webinar is on Tuesday, November 7th, where Dr. Andy Tompkins will be presenting on the topic of treatments and medications for opioid use disorder. So I think with that, we can wrap things up just a little bit early.
Amy, we actually have another question in the chat if we have a few minutes.
We do have a few minutes.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so we have a question from, let me just see, from Lauren. She asks, what do you suggest as next steps in this area of research in a research world without boundaries?
So I basically made a quick response. You know, it turns out that many people don't stay in these recovery homes long enough. Often people leave within the first couple of weeks, even the first month. I think the critical issue is why? Why do some connect up, have friends, have most important people, others don't? So I do think trying to figure out how we keep people in there, how we make the circumstances so that they'll have the possibilities of really getting the dose that I think is critical, which I think is 6 months. I think that is a really critical. If I were to say there's an important question, that would be one of the most important ones for me. I'm focusing on social networks to try to examine that, but there's certainly lots of ways of doing it.
And I would say along those lines, we have a paper, hopefully that will get submitted fairly soon, addressing reasons for leaving treatment. And I think that's a good place to start. We need to hear from the residents themselves why they opted to leave. And then based on that understanding, I think we need to figure out how to keep them in the houses longer. Another question that is a little bit trickier, I know there's the 6-month time period that is associated with better outcome, but I think it's different for different residents. I think some residents probably don't need a 6-month time period. And there may be some residents who need a longer period. And I think we need to understand why that is better. The other thing I would say is, you know, we're finishing up a grant that's looking at individual house and neighborhood characteristics and how those characteristics affect outcome, the relative effect of those characteristics. And I think that's an important aspect of where we're headed. We need to understand the various ways that recovery home residents can be affected in the various types of variables that affect them. So those would be my initial thoughts.
Wonderful. I'm so glad that we snuck one more question in there. So we are at the top of the hour. If folks have additional questions, feel free to leave them in the chat because we are recording this and we can capture the chat. But for all other folks, we're going to sign off. Thank you for showing up today.